So our theme this month is talking about charity, and I'm going to be talking about an argument that the philosopher Peter Singer at Princeton University has given, which he uses an example that I'm not sure whether he came up with it. It's fairly popular in popular culture now, but he's the person who originated the discussion of this in the philosophy literature anyways. So the example starts out by imagining that you've come upon a pond where there's a small girl drowning in the pond. And there's nobody else nearby. You can tell that the girl's going to die if you don't go in and rescue her. But unfortunately, you have your nice new $50 shoes on, and you can imagine there are sharp rocks in the pond. There'd be no way to go in there and rescue her without wearing your nice new shoes in, and you can recognize that your nice new $50 shoes would be wrecked if you went into the pond and saved the girl. So the question is, what should you do in this case? And Singer thinks the answer in this case is pretty obvious, that morally you need to go in and save the girl, that anybody who would just walk on by, save their $50 shoes, and let a little girl die would be doing something horrible. They'd be a monster. None of us would do that sort of thing. I think all of us would be willing to sacrifice a $50 pair of shoes in order to save a little girl who's drowning. Okay, so that's the sort of warm-up case. Here's another case. There's a little girl living in Africa who's also in a pretty dire situation. She needs vaccines to keep her from dying due to illness. She needs some food to keep her alive. In fact, this stuff isn't all that expensive. $50 would be enough to save her life. And there are charitable organizations that you could send the $50 to, and by sending $50 to this charitable organization, you could save this little girl's life. So again, you're faced with a choice. Do I use the $50 to buy a fancy new pair of shoes? Maybe not even all that fancy of a new pair of shoes, depending on what you buy. Or do you spend the $50 to save a little girl's life? And in this case, a lot of people seem to have the other answer. At least a lot of us don't. In fact, I'm wearing $50 shoes right now, I'm hesitant to admit. A lot of us don't send $50 to charity in this sort of circumstance, and sort of Singer's point is to say, well, these two cases are really quite similar. In both cases, there's a child who will live or die, and the choice of whether they're going to live or die depends on whether or not you spend the $50 on a new pair of shoes or send the $50 in a way that ends up saving the child's life instead. So Singer thinks, well, really these two cases are so similar to one another that really we ought to give the same answer in both of these. So here this is written out as an argument from analogy. So as a first premise we have, it's pretty clear that you ought to rescue the girl in the pond despite having to give up your $50 pair of shoes. Second premise, there's no moral difference between these two cases. And if that's right, then that gets you to the conclusion that you should give up buying expensive new shoes and instead try to prevent starvation. Singer takes the first premise to be pretty obvious. So if you think about the case involving the little girl, it's just obvious that you really need to go in and save the girl. It would be a horrible, monstrous thing to do to not save the girl. The second premise might be a little less obvious, and so Singer considers a number of different potential disanalogies between the two cases that you might think raise a moral difference. So here's one difference between the cases. Seems like when the little girl's drowning in the pond, if there's nobody else nearby, then you know it's entirely up to you whether or not the girl's going to be rescued or not. But in the case of children starving in Africa, well, I could send $50, but there are lots of other people, including people who are a bit richer than I am, a bit closer than I am, stuff like that, who could also send $50 and save the children equally well. And so maybe the fact that there are more other people who are situated to help in the starving children case, maybe that makes a moral difference in the two cases. But here's a reason to think that maybe that's not true. Imagine a variant of the girl drowning in the pond case where there actually are lots of people standing nearby. You can see that they aren't doing anything. They're just standing there. The girl's still drowning in the pond, even though there are other people who could help. They aren't helping. And so you're faced with a choice. Nobody else is helping. It's my $50 shoes or let the girl drown. And Singer thinks in this case also it's pretty clear that it would be monstrous for you to choose your shoes over the girl in the pond, even if there are other people standing nearby. The fact that they're being jerks and not helping out doesn't get you morally off the hook for not helping out yourself. So if that sort of reasoning is right, then it seems like the fact that there are other people involved doesn't really give us a moral reason not to give to charity. In fact, psychologists, there's a lot of work on the bystander effect. This does play a role in the decision-making that people ordinarily make, but the point that Singer's trying to make is that, at least morally, the fact that there are other people who could be helping but aren't doesn't get us off the hook. We're still responsible for helping, even if there are other people who are making bad choices at the same time as we are. Okay, here's another potential disanalogy. The little girl drowning in the pond, at least a natural way of imagining the case, she's right here next to us, here in North America, quite nearby. The kids starving in Africa are halfway around the world from us. And you might think that there's some sort of important difference, that we have a moral responsibility to help our neighbors or the other people in our nation rather than other people in the world instead. And Singer grants that at one time this sort of reasoning probably made sense, that at least once upon a time people didn't really know very well what was going on in other parts of the world, and they didn't really have the power to bring about very many changes in any sort of direct way in other parts of the world. And so at that time, it probably makes sense to sort of act locally, try to fix the problems here where you know pretty well what the situation is and you have a pretty good opportunity to make a difference. But it seems like today we don't live in that sort of world. Today we have the information technology to know really well what's happening all over the world. And we have the technology to, you can wire money and it can get there near instantaneously. And so we really have the capacity to make a difference halfway around the world and to know that we're making a difference halfway around the world. So it seems like these the ways in which distance versus proximity used to make a difference, it's not clear that it makes nearly such a difference anymore, and so it's hard to sort of justify thinking that we really should treat people morally differently depending on where they are in the world. It's hard to justify that sort of conclusion. Good. Okay, so were two potential disanalogies between the cases, and it seems like even considering both these disanalogies, we end up thinking that, well, really there isn't an important difference after all between these two cases, that if it's right to save the girl in the pond, this should be right to save the girl starving in Africa. Here's another sort of response that people would sometimes give, is to say, wait a sec, why should I spend money on kids starving in Africa? Aren't there other ways that would be even better to spend my money? And you could think of other ways. So you could think about maybe I should spend my money, instead of giving it directly to aid in Africa, maybe I should spend my money publicizing the plight of people in Africa here, so even more people will end up giving money, and it'll end up having gathered more money for people in Africa. And Singer's happy to allow that. Well, maybe that would be a better way to spend the money. He doesn't have a particular opinion about what the most effective way of spending charitable donations would be. So one way of thinking of this is if you have this sort of devil on your shoulder advising you to buy shoes, and an angel on your shoulder suggesting that you should help the starving children in Africa, well, maybe there are other angels on your shoulder also suggesting other good ways of spending your money instead. So you could campaign for governmental reform. You could work to try to prevent overpopulation with either birth control programs or educational programs, stuff like that. Here's a trickier one, especially for me, is you might think, well, a better way to spend my money right now is to advance my current social position so that later I'll be more influential or more wealthy and I'll have the opportunity later to do a lot more good. And I felt myself falling into this reasoning where I'm like, well, I won't give to charity now. I'm a starving student. I'll finish my degree and then and I'll get a good job. And then for me, I'm a professor. It's I'll get tenure and then I'll start worrying about contributing to these things. And so you can keep pushing down the road the thought that, well, eventually I'll start making a difference in the world. But right now it's more important to focus on me. And Singer emphasizes here that in this case, well, if you want to spend your money on one of these other things instead of on directly helping people who are starving to death, he doesn't have a strong argument against you. But But it seems like a lot of us are, sadly like me, we don't end up spending our money too much on these other things, and I can hope that at some point in my life I will feel confident enough in my social position and my wealth that I really will start making a big difference in the world. But if you aren't going to do these other things, and instead you just go ahead and buy the fancy new shoes and stuff like that, that's the thing that Singer thinks you need to really morally worry about, whether you're doing the right thing or not. Okay. So one natural question that arises here is, well, how much money should I give? So far we've just been talking about one $50 donation, should you give it or not? And here's an argument that Singer puts forward. It's pretty similar to the argument from analogy I put up before. He says, well, sending $50 would prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything of moral significance. So a child starving to death needlessly, that would be something bad to have happen. Giving up a pair of shoes when you have lots of other shoes you could wear instead, that's not morally significant. So if you can stop something bad from happening without sacrificing anything of moral significance, Singer thinks, well, it's a moral principle that we should. He thinks this is just obvious. Whatever sort of moral view you have, that, at least limited moral principle, is pretty obviously true, and those two premises together get you to the conclusion that we should send the $50. And if you think about this argument, this tells you, well, if you have another $50 after the first $50 and you can send it without sacrificing anything of moral significance, then you should send that $50 also. And so this argument tells you to keep donating until you're needing to sacrifice something that's morally significant. And different people would probably have different views on what it's morally significant to need to sacrifice. One sort of plausible view would be, if it's straining your family relations, putting your family in a worse circumstance, then that might be a morally significant cost that you're needing to pay. And as far as this argument here is concerned, once it's starting to strain your family relations, maybe that's a reason for you to no longer need to be contributing to charity. I don't know, even in this case, it's not clear to me that a little more family stress versus kids dying, whether choosing to alleviate the family stress and let the kids die, whether that really is a morally defensible choice. But Singer's saying, most of us don't even get to that point. We're just spending money on luxury goods that we could be saving lives with. So it's not anything morally significant that we're giving up. And so even this argument would be enough to change a lot of people's behavior from the way that they currently behave. Singer himself is sympathetic to the claim that, well, we should keep on giving, even while there's sort of inconvenience to our family, stress in my family, stuff like that. That still isn't as bad as letting kids die. And so Singer thinks there's probably a good argument for thinking you should keep giving until it actually hurts you more than the amount of help you'd be doing by giving. And this would be, would require us to behave radically differently than we do now. That given how many people there are starving in the third world, how many people there are living on less than $1 a day, if we were going to keep giving our money away until our lives were as bad as those lives, that would require a drastic change in how the world works. And so Singer sort of explicitly says if he could convince people to accept the first argument, to just keep giving until they have to give up something of moral significance, that would make real changes in the world. He thinks that probably technically the right thing to do is to keep on giving until you're hurting. Giving more would hurt you more than it would help other people, but he'd be happy if he could just convince people of the first of these claims. Okay, so this has been sort of a drab, moralizing sort of talk, so I'm going to finish off with a cartoon here. So in this cartoon, I'm not sure whether you'll be able to read it, but the cartoonist is basically describing the same case as Singer does. So the blue character says, well, I've seen these children starving on TV. Do I need to contribute to charity to help them? And the green character says, well, consider the child drowning in the pond. Wouldn't you have an obligation to help her? The blue character says, well, maybe so. The green character says, what do you mean, maybe? Of course you would. And the blue character admits, okay, I'd be obligated to save the child in the pond. And then the green character says, well, the point is there's an important analogy between these cases. If you should help the child drowning, then you really ought to be sending money to charity. And so here's the take-home message that the blue character got, which may or may not be the right take-home message to get. The blue character says, Well, I see. So what you're saying is, as long as I'm willing to let little kids drown, then it's okay for me not to send money to relief organizations. Thanks, Gabe. So there's your take-home message.